So we learned about the Redux Persist library in the last lesson. But now we are actually going to implement and use it inside of our application. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to bring the Redux Persist library into our application. And we simply do it by saying yarn add Redux Persist. Now, Redux Persist is really cool because it lets us leverage either local storage or session storage very easily from the package we just installed. And it's got a little bit of some setup and configuration that we have to do, but it's nothing too daunting. All we need to do is we need to go to our store.js file and make some modifications. So right now, all we're exporting out is our store. And as you remember, it is just a combination of our root reducer and our middlewares. Now what we're going to do is we're also going to import in our new Redux Persist, bringing in the persist store function from Redux Persist. Now, what this does is it allows our browser to actually cache our store now, depending on certain configuration options that we're going to set. But all you need to understand first inside of this store.js is that we're bringing in this persist store. And what we're doing is we're exporting the store out, but we're also going to export out this new thing called a persister. And all this thing does is it calls our persist store, passing in our store. So this persister is essentially a persisted version of our store. And using this and our store is how we will actually create our new provider that's wrapping our application. If that sounds confusing, don't worry. It'll make more sense once we actually write all the code. But all we're doing here in our store is we're creating this new persisted version of our store, right? Using this persister object. Now that we have this, as far as our export default goes, we're just going to return an object, right, that gives both the store and the persister. Now we'll actually have access to both of these things if we need it, but we actually won't really use it, but it's just good for us to write it in case we ever want it. Now that we have our store.js updated, we need to actually update our root reducer. Inside of our root reducer, we're going to import in persist reducer because we persisted our store before, but now we want to persist our reducer. So we're going to import persist reducer from Redux Persist. And we're going to also import in the type of storage we want. If we say import storage from Redux Persist /lib/storage, what we'll get here is the actual local storage object on our window browser. So this is essentially telling Redux Persist, I want to use local storage as my default storage. Alternatively, you can also import session storage, which is from a different package link. So these are just representative of the folders that we need to go into in order to get session storage. I can't remember off the top of my head what the actual session storage library is, but you can find it very easily inside of the Redux Persist docs that I have linked in the resources. But what we want to use is just the regular storage. So this is perfectly fine for us. And what we do with this is we have to define a new persist config. So this is pretty much just the JSON object that represents the possible configurations that we want for Redux Persist to use. As I mentioned, it's just an object, and we need to tell it the key. So our key is root, essentially meaning at what point inside of our reducer object do we want to start storing everything. And we want to start from the root. Then we want to pass storage in as storage. So this will say the storage key goes to whatever the storage object from Redux Persist we're trying to use is. And then finally, we can pass in this whitelist property. And this property is an array containing the string names of any of the reducers that we want to store. So here we have two, user and cart. But of course, our user is being handled by Firebase authentication. So there's no reason for us to actually persist this. Instead, all we want to persist is the cart. So we're just going to pass in a string that says cart, which lets Redux persist know that the only thing we want to whitelist, i.e. the only reducer that we actually want to persist, is the cart. Now, if in the future we added more and more reducers to our combine reducers call, and we wanted to actually persist them as well, we would just throw the new key in after our cart inside of this whitelist array. So it's very simple, just like that. Now, I know there was a couple configuration things we had to do, which might seem a little odd, but this is really just how we have to use it. After this, what we need to do is we have to actually call this our root reducer, because we have to wrap this inside of our new persist reducer call. What we were exporting before, we're now setting as this root reducer. And what we're going to export as the default instead is calling this persist reducer as a function, passing in both our persist config as well as our root reducer. So this will return back out of this function now, and what we're exporting by default as well, this modified version of our root reducer with this persist config on top of it. So it's a modified version of our root reducer, except now with persistence capabilities, thanks to this persist reducer function that we got from Redux Persist. Finally, inside of our index.js, we just need to now actually bring in the actual persister that we need, as well as the component that will leverage inside of our application that will give it the context of our new persisted reducer. So what we need to do is import in this new component called persistgate from Redux Persist /integration/React. Of course, Redux Persist, you might be wondering, why is there a React integration? Well, this is because you can actually use this with multiple different platforms. Redux Persist exists for any platform that might leverage Redux, including React Native and Electron. Those have their own separate files that we need to import different things for. This one is specific for us with React. So with the persistgate, we need to actually bring in our new persister as well as the store. So from our Redux store, we just need to make sure that we're also bringing in our persister. And then we're going to wrap our app inside of this persistgate, where we now pass into the persistgate the persister that we wrote inside of our Redux store. The persister being the persisted version of our store. Now, we want to make sure to wrap our app in this persistgate, because what we want to do is have our application always have access to the persistence flow itself. What this will do is it'll allow the persistgate to actually, one, receive the store, but also fire off actions that will rehydrate the state whenever our application refreshes. So here we'll see, when we go back to our application, that you'll see that this is actually still there from whenever I added it earlier. So let's add more items in, go to our checkout, and now when I refresh, you'll see that this is still there. And the reason why is because of these actions that are firing. This first persist action coming from the persist library is checking whether or not anything exists. And then if it does, it will fire off this new action that will say, hey, I want to rehydrate the state with whatever it is that we've stored inside of our preferred means of storage. And here we'll see that before, our cart was simply just the empty initial state we had. And after the rehydrate state, our cart is updated with the things that we wanted to update with. So this is really great for us because now we're finally able to actually maintain cart state of our cart items across sessions. So this is a great thing about Redux Persist and Redux as a whole. It lets us leverage local storage in order to gain access to this powerful feature of being able to persist our application state across sessions and across tabs. So this is a great feature for us, and it's really necessary in an e-commerce platform. And I know there was quite a bit of configuration here that we had to write, but this is simply all we need to do just to use it. Now, of course, if you want to see what other configurations you can add for your own needs in the future when you join any team with an application that's using Redux, you can always look at the docs that I've linked in your resources. So let's move on with our next lesson.